Federalist Paper 18, Part 2. This is done by Madison with the help of Hamilton. Among the confederacies of antiquity, the most considerable was that of the Grecian republics, associated under the Amphictyonic Council. From the best accounts transmitted of this celebrated institution, it bore a very instructive analogy to the present Confederation of the American States. So we talked about Madison having studied all the ancient and modern confederacies. Now here in the papers 18, 19, and 20, he will look at the weaknesses of all the confederacies in history, all the important ones. And he will draw analogy. He will say why the confederacy that we are trying to replace is like these bad confederacies, these weak confederacies. So he's going to bring up examples. The members retained the character of independent and sovereign states and had equal votes in the Federal Council. This council had a general authority to propose and resolve whatever it judged necessary for the common welfare of Greece, to declare and carry on war, to decide in the last resort all the controversies between the members, to fine the aggressing party, to employ the whole force of the Confederacy against the disobedient, to admit new members. Amphictyons were the guardians of religion and of the immense riches belonging to the Temple of Delphos, where they had the right of jurisdiction in controversies between the inhabitants and those who came to consult the oracle. As a further provision for the efficacy of the federal powers, they took an oath mutually to defend and protect the United Cities. To punish the violators of this oath and to inflict vengeance on sacrilegious despoilers of the temple. In theory and upon paper, this apparatus of powers seems amply sufficient for all general purposes. In several material instances, they exceed the powers enumerated in the Articles of Confederation. The Amphictyons had in their hand the superstition of the times, one of the principal engines by which government was then maintained. They had a declared authority to use coercion against refractory cities and were bound by oath to exert this authority on the necessary occasions. Very different, nevertheless, was the experiment from theory. Okay, I'll read this again. Very different, nevertheless, was the experiment from theory. The powers, like those of the present Congress, were administered by deputies appointed wholly by the cities in their political capacities, and exercised over them in the same capacities. Hence the weakness, the disorders, and finally the destruction of the Confederacy. the more powerful members, instead of being kept in awe and subordination, tyrannized successively over all the rest. Athens, as we learn from Demosthenes, was the arbiter of Greece 73 years. The Lacedaemonians next governed it 29 years. At a subsequent period, after the Battle of Leuctra, the Thebans had their turn of domination. Okay, in front of you on the screen, I have something that's very important for us to know. Thomas Jefferson was in Paris when the Philadelphia Convention took place. He had been in Paris as a minister to France, as America's minister, or at the time they would call the ambassadors ministers, but there were different titles depending on the positions. But he was the minister to France, and James Madison had asked them to send as many books he could find in Paris on the history of the world, on the history of confederacies, old, ancient, modern. And in a letter on September 1st, 1784, Jefferson writes to Madison that he'll be sending books. He uses the word trunk loads, which he's talking about almost 2 luggages full of books on history. And here in this Federalist and elsewhere, you will see that Madison will refer to these books. The reason this is important is that Madison went out of his way for a number of years to study the history of the world, of different confederacies. And he probably more than anyone else had reflected more on what history has to teach us. Every other founding fathers of this nation did the same. You know, Jefferson, Hamilton, Benjamin Franklin, James Wilson, and some of the other ones that were very, very well read, John Jay. But Madison, it looks like more than others, had done his homework. He had read a lot, and this is very important for us because it tells us that if we want to be knowledgeable, to act like a good citizen, not only citizen of this country, but the citizen of the world, we have to be informed. We have to know what is going on around the world. Right now, when political scientists and commentators and historians talk about the Federalist Papers, they don't mention Federalist 18, 19, 20 as being important because America is united after a civil war that killed around 700,000 people. But for us, for you, for anybody who's being deeply reflective of where we are going in the future, study of history is very important, extremely important. And that's why you will see me refer to Madison's work over and over again in the study of history, which is what we're doing. Madison, after studying all the books that Jefferson had sent him, plus knowing what had happened in 13 different states that were going to be the states of this new United States, he had studied what had happened there the last 11 years, the previous 11 years, from 1776 to 1787. So he wrote 2 long notes, 2 monographs to himself. One is Notes on Ancient and Modern Confederacies. He did that in 1786 before going to Annapolis Convention. But remember, in Annapolis, nothing happened. That's why they decided to go to Philadelphia. And then the following year, before going to the Philadelphia Convention, he wrote something called Vices of the Political System of the United States. And this is what we will be doing in a way. We'll study the Federalist Papers all around the world, and that's what we will think about, consider. What are the good things about the American federal system? What are its vices? What are the bad things about it? Because it can't be perfect, as we know it is not. So we have to study it, find out what is wrong with it, what the problems are, and go forward. So keep this in mind. As we go through all of the Federalist Papers, just make sure that we are not going to blindly read everything and without thinking about it, accept things 100%. Because a citizen of the world, a citizen of the United States, needs to be deliberative. Remember, that's one of the first words, one of the first important verbs that Hamilton uses in the first Federalist Paper. The words to deliberate means to think deeply, patiently,